Something that has the potential to reshape the global economic landscape may already be unfolding, and the most significant developments are not arriving with fanfare from Washington, D.C. Instead, the center of conversation appears to be shifting eastward. In Tokyo, far from the usual venues of global economic announcements, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney participated in a far-reaching interview that touched on trade, geopolitics, economic strategy, and the future of global cooperation. What he described wasn't a minor adjustment. It was a bold vision for a new economic architecture that could fundamentally alter how countries interact, compete, and collaborate on the world stage. In Tokyo, Carney revealed an idea ambitious in scale and transformative in its implications. A nascent plan to create a new form of economic alliance bridging Europe and the Asia-Pacific. This alliance would not be a modest regional pact or a bilateral trade agreement, but rather a potentially massive economic space connecting existing trade frameworks, specifically the European Union and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. If brought to fruition, this networked economic bloc could encompass roughly 1.5 billion people, making it by far the largest integrated market on the planet. That would place it ahead of the United States, ahead of China, and ahead of any single economic entity in history. To grasp the magnitude of this idea, it helps to step back and consider the context in which it was proposed. For the past several decades, the global economic order has been shaped by a series of carefully constructed agreements, international institutions, and cooperative frameworks designed to bind nations to predictable patterns of trade and shared prosperity. Organizations such as the World Trade Organization, regional trade agreements, and multilateral forums were instruments of stability, built on the assumption that integration leads to mutual benefit. Countries could specialize in production, innovate across borders, and create supply chains optimized for efficiency and growth. But that structure is facing stress unlike anything seen in a generation. According to Carney, the trade system that governed global economic cooperation for decades is no longer functioning in the way it once did. What was once a largely rules-based system centered around cooperation and shared benefit has gradually shifted into something more unstable and unpredictable. Economic integration, rather than serving as a bridge between nations, is increasingly being wielded as a geopolitical weapon. Tariffs, trade sanctions, and supply chain manipulations are now tools of statecraft rather than instruments of mutual gain. Trade relationships are no longer purely commercial. They are strategic levers capable of influencing political outcomes. Carney described this shift as a rupture in the global order. In this emerging environment, governments can no longer rely on traditional norms or expect that long-standing agreements will be honored indefinitely. Instead, economic relationships have become extensions of national power, and in some cases, mechanisms of coercion. Nations that once believed that deep economic ties guaranteed stability now find those same ties exploited to exert influence or extract concessions. In such a world, economic sovereignty becomes a central concern. How can a country remain autonomous and resilient when its prosperity depends on partners that may use access as leverage? At the heart of this rupture is the influence of economic nationalism, particularly the policies that have emerged from the United States under Donald Trump's presidency. Tariffs, once considered instruments of last resort in trade disputes, have become central to Washington's economic policy. Allies have been threatened with punitive barriers, supply chains have been strained, and long-standing agreements, many of which provided the foundation for decades of predictable global commerce, have suddenly become uncertain or renegotiated under new terms. For many nations, this environment generates anxiety. When a major economic power begins to treat trade as a tool of pressure, other countries are forced to reassess how they engage with the world. For some, this means recalibrating strategic relationships, diversifying dependencies, or even rethinking long-held alliances. Canada, as Carney outlined, is approaching this moment not with paralysis, but with strategy. Rather than wait to see how the global landscape evolves, Canadian leadership appears committed to building new frameworks capable of withstanding uncertainty and providing alternative paths for cooperation. Central to Carney's vision is a simple but powerful idea. Countries should seek alliances built around shared values and shared interests, not rigid blocks where agreement is assumed on every issue. Carney acknowledged that no two countries will align perfectly on all matters. Differences in priorities and perspectives are natural. What matters, he suggested, is identifying areas where cooperation is both possible and mutually beneficial. This philosophy underpins his discussion of a broad coalition of willing partners, flexible groupings that vary depending on the issue at hand. The coalition that backs Ukraine, for example, is broad but not universal. The group of states collaborating on critical minerals is distinct from that supporting defense partnerships or energy networks. Each of these alliances is tailored to a specific purpose, not all-encompassing agreements, but issue-based compacts that deliver results where interests align. At the outer end of this spectrum lies Carney's most ambitious proposal, linking the European Union and the CPTPP into a unified economic space. Both frameworks represent significant regional commitments to trade and regulatory cooperation. The EU encompasses dozens of countries bound by deep economic integration, while the CPTPP connects Pacific economies from Japan and Canada to Southeast Asia and beyond, creating one of the most expansive trade networks in the world. Carney's vision is not merely to recognize these networks side by side, but to weave them together into a connected economic bloc. If successful, the implications of such an arrangement are enormous. A connected EU-Pacific economic area would span continents, creating a market of unprecedented scale. Businesses operating within this space would have access to customers and suppliers across multiple regions, enabling supply chains that move seamlessly across borders and oceans. Industries ranging from artificial intelligence and information technology to manufacturing, energy, and critical minerals could find fertile ground for expansion, collaboration, and innovation. More than that, such an economic alignment would give participating countries enhanced leverage in shaping global norms. Standards for trade, data flows, environmental practices, labor protections, and digital commerce could be set by a coalition commanding collective influence larger than any single nation. Regulatory frameworks developed within this bloc could become de facto global standards, shaping how commerce is conducted across the world. This level of integration would be transformative, not only because of its size, but because it represents a new model of cooperation, one that blends regional architectures into a more interconnected whole. Instead of a world divided into isolated zones of influence or dominated by unilateral power, the global economy could evolve into a networked space of interlocking partnerships. Carney's approach emphasizes diversification as the central defense against coercion. In a world where economic ties can be weaponized, reliance on a single partner, no matter how large or powerful, becomes a strategic vulnerability. By building an ecosystem of collaborations across geographies, sectors, and political systems, countries can reduce their exposure to risk and increase their ability to adapt to disruption. In Canada's case, this strategic thrust reflects both pragmatic considerations and historical strengths. The country already maintains deep and multifaceted relationships with key players on both sides of this envisioned alliance. Canada has a comprehensive trade agreement with the European Union and is an influential member of the CPTPP. These connections give it a unique ability to function as a bridge between Western and Pacific economies, a connector state capable of forging links that might otherwise be difficult to establish. Carney pointed to a range of ongoing and forthcoming negotiations designed to expand Canada's global economic footprint. Talks with the Philippines, Thailand, and ASEAN countries indicate a willingness to engage with diverse markets. Strengthened ties with Australia, deepening connections with India, and continued collaboration with European partners demonstrate Canada's intent to anchor itself in multiple strategic directions. In these relationships, trade is not the only focus. Defense cooperation, technological partnerships, shared research, and mutual economic development all have a role to play. This outward-looking posture stands in stark contrast to the inward-leaning approach adopted by some countries, where one major economy has turned its focus inward and embraced protectionist policies. Canada appears to be widening its horizons, seeking new opportunities for collaboration rather than retreating from global engagement. The result is a strategy that enhances flexibility, spreads risk, and positions the country at the intersection of competing networks. Carney also emphasized that the new world of international cooperation will not resemble the old one. Instead of static alliances fixed in place by overarching treaties, the future may be defined by dynamic, issue-specific groupings where countries come together on particular challenges and part ways on others. These adaptive clusters, what Carney described as variable geometry alliances, allow nations to cooperate intensely where interests align while preserving independence where they diverge. This model acknowledges the complexity and unpredictability of contemporary geopolitics. In a world marked by rapid technological change, shifting power balances, and frequent disruptions, flexibility becomes a strategic asset. Countries that can pivot, form new partnerships, and reconfigure alliances are better prepared to withstand shocks and capitalize on emerging opportunities. If Carney's proposals take shape, the consequences will be far-reaching. A combined EU-Pacific economic bloc would be larger than any current global competitor. Its influence would extend into regulatory frameworks, supply chain design, industrial policy, and international standard setting. It could redefine how trade is conducted, how investments flow, how technologies are governed, and how economic power is distributed. In effect, such an alliance could mark the emergence of a new center of gravity in the global economy. Not a single dominant state, but a coalition of countries working together across continents. It would be a model of cooperation born out of necessity, driven by shared interests, and designed for a world where economic ties are no longer guaranteed to be harmonious. This development reflects a deeper transformation in international politics. The old system, dominated by a handful of major powers and governed by predictable norms, is giving way to a more fluid landscape of partnerships, coalitions, and flexible alignments. Power is no longer measured solely by economic size or military strength, but by the ability to cultivate relationships, foster connectivity, and adapt to changing conditions. In that environment, countries like Canada have the potential to play a role far bigger than their population or GDP might suggest, not as passive participants, but as architects of new forms of cooperation. Ultimately, what Carney described in Tokyo isn't merely a trade strategy. It is a vision for how nations can navigate uncertainty, protect sovereignty, and prosper in an unpredictable world. It challenges conventional assumptions about power and influence, urging countries to look beyond traditional alliances and invest in networks capable of withstanding geopolitical turbulence. If this vision becomes reality, it could signal the beginning of a new era in global economics, one defined not by domination, but by partnership, not by isolation, but by interconnection, not by unilateral influence, but by shared leadership across continents.